Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on big business, labor revolt, and federal power in the industrial order. The core question is this: what leverage did workers and farmers have when corporations controlled mills, freight, payrolls, markets, and lawyers? The core competency is to contrast the expansion of big business with the growth of America's industrial and agrarian labor movements. What leverage does a steelworker, rail hand, or factory mechanic still possess when the firm on the other side controls the mill, the freight line, the payroll, and the lawyers? By the 1870s and 1880s, industrial capitalism had moved beyond the scale of the small shop and local merchant house. Railroads, telegraph lines, and multi-state corporations allowed giant firms to coordinate raw materials, transport, labor, pricing, and investment in one system. Andrew Carnegie built steel around the Bessemer process, and the Edgar Thomson Works after 1875. John D. Rockefeller integrated refining, pipelines, and storage through Standard Oil, and J.P. Morgan assembled capital through banking and reorganization. Size itself had become a source of power. That scale changed the meaning of freedom at work. A worker confronting an integrated corporation faced an employer that could shift production, blacklist organizers, draw on court injunctions, and rely on police or militia support when conflict intensified. Output rose and some prices fell, but so did the chance that an individual worker could bargain on anything like equal terms. The central issue in steel, rail, packing, and mining was not whether employers had authority. It was how much authority could be concentrated before bargaining became structurally one-sided. Industrial leaders defended concentration as efficiency. Carnegie tied ore, coke, mills, rail links, and sales into one administrative chain. Rockefeller used favored freight arrangements, buyouts, and price discipline to stabilize markets that had once been volatile. Admirers saw order and lower costs. Critics saw monopoly leverage and labor discipline strong enough to shape the fate of whole towns and regions, which is why large-scale labor organization rose in the same places that large-scale capital had made individual resistance weak. The industrial background to labor revolt included specific technologies, statutes, and business practices. Carnegie's mills depended on the Bessemer converter, on large blast furnaces, on coking coal from western Pennsylvania, and on a transport network that could move ore from the Mesabi Range and finished steel to railroads, bridges, and urban construction sites. Rockefeller's rise depended on refining capacity, on storage, on barrel production, on pipeline systems, and on freight rebates negotiated with major rail lines. The South Improvement Company episode of 1872 exposed how those rebates worked. Preferred refiners received lower rates and inside information, while rivals paid more and lost access to the same market intelligence. Standard Oil kept growing even after public criticism ended that specific arrangement. Business consolidation also took legal form. A trust could place several companies under a single board, reducing rivalry while keeping a veneer of separate corporate existence. State corporation laws were flexible enough to encourage growth, and courts frequently treated property rights and contract rights as fundamental. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, but enforcement in the early 1890s was uncertain and often weaker than popular anger against monopoly suggested. Large firms therefore expanded in a climate where the language of competition still survived, even as competitive markets were being reorganized through mergers, pools, and administrative control. Corporate growth also depended on precise cost discipline inside the plant. At Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Works, managers measured tonnage, furnace output, rail orders, and labor costs with a rigor earlier workshops had never attempted. Open hearth furnaces gradually joined Bessemer production because they allowed more flexible steel quality for bridges, skyscrapers, and machinery. In oil, Standard did not rely on refining alone. It built tank cars, negotiated pipeline control after the 1870s, and used Cleveland, New York, and export connections to squeeze independent refiners who could not match its scale. A national market was being assembled through ledgers, rate sheets, patent licenses, and legal incorporation rather than through local bargaining. Workers lived inside a very different set of facts. Industrial labor often meant 10 or 12-hour days, dangerous machinery, periodic unemployment, wage reductions during downturns, and almost no control over the pace or discipline of the shop. Skilled workers had some leverage, but that leverage declined as machinery simplified tasks or allowed employers to replace experienced men more easily. Immigrant labor, child labor, and a reserve of unemployed workers also weakened bargaining. The Knights of Labor tried to answer this structure by organizing across skill lines and by imagining cooperative alternatives to the wage system. The American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886 under Samuel Gompers, narrowed its focus to skilled workers, shorter hours, wage gains, and working conditions that could actually be negotiated. Alternative paths existed, but they were not the paths most industrial leaders chose. Employers could have accepted unions as bargaining partners. Legislatures could have restricted the use of injunctions. Public officials could have enforced antitrust law more aggressively or built labor protection sooner. Those possibilities remained thin. When the Depression of 1893 struck, falling demand, layoffs, wage cuts, and business failures sharpened the conflict. The economy narrowed workers' choices at the very moment when large firms still demanded stable output, regular freight movement, and obedience inside the shop. The Homestead Strike of 1892 at Carnegie Steel's Homestead plant revealed how industrial conflict was handled before Pullman made the same pattern visible at a national scale. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's chief lieutenant, announced wage cuts after the union contract expired. He fortified the plant, built a fence topped with wire, and hired Pinkerton guards to secure the works. On July 6, 1892, armed conflict broke out between strikers and Pinkertons on the Monongahela River. The Pinkertons surrendered, but the Pennsylvania militia later occupied the town, and the plant resumed operation under non-union labor. Carnegie's public reputation as a benefactor survived, yet Homestead showed that managerial authority in the steel industry rested on lockouts, private force, and state protection when necessary. George Pullman's company town outside Chicago created a different structure of dependence. Pullman controlled the factory, but he also controlled rents, services, and much of the built environment of the town established in the 1880s. During the Depression of 1893 and 1894, wages fell while rents and utility charges did not decline in the same proportion. Workers complained that household budgets were collapsing under a system where the employer controlled both pay and daily living costs. The grievance was therefore larger than a wage dispute. It centered on the concentration of authority over labor, housing, and discipline in the same corporate hands. The American Railway Union made that concentration visible across a continental system. Debs founded the ARU in June 1893 after frustration with older craft unions that divided engineers, firemen, switchmen, and conductors into separate organizations. The new union won a strike against the Great Northern in 1894 and entered Pullman with recent success behind it. Once the boycott began, railroad executives understood that attached sleeping cars could turn a factory dispute into a stoppage, touching mail routes, livestock shipments, grain traffic, and passenger timetables from Chicago to the Pacific Coast. Coordination among managers proved as powerful as coordination among workers. Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union transformed that local grievance into a national confrontation. The ARU, founded in 1893, aimed to organize railroad workers across crafts rather than by narrow trade lines. When Pullman workers struck in May 1894, the union later refused to handle Pullman cars because those cars were attached to trains across large rail networks. The boycott spread through the Midwest and disrupted traffic, freight schedules, and mail service. Railroad managers coordinated their response through the General Managers Association. They added Pullman cars to trains deliberately, framed the boycott as an attack on interstate commerce, and sought judicial relief through the federal courts. Attorney General Richard Olney, a former railroad lawyer, backed the use of injunctions. Federal courts ordered the strike leaders to stop interfering with the mails and interstate commerce. President Grover Cleveland then sent federal troops into Chicago in July 1894. Violence followed. Property was damaged, and the strike collapsed under military pressure, arrests, and employer coordination. Debs went to jail for violating the injunction. In re Debs, decided by the Supreme Court in 1895, upheld the federal government's authority to intervene on behalf of interstate commerce and the mails. The ruling gave legal force to an already visible pattern. When labor conflict interrupted the circulation systems of the national economy, federal authority would likely protect movement before it protected worker bargaining power. When federal lawyers carried the Pullman Papers into court in July 1894, they were building a chain of authority strong enough to move judges, marshals, and troops in the same direction. Their language was chosen for speed and force. Terms such as obstructing the mails and interfering with interstate commerce turned a wage dispute in a company town into a national emergency on paper before it was crushed on the ground. That wording gave Attorney General Richard Olney and the rail managers a usable legal bridge from broken schedules to federal coercion. The pressure inside those filings came from what they excluded. There was no comparable legal urgency around rent deductions in Pullman houses, the cut in wages after orders declined, or the household arithmetic that pushed workers into revolt. The injunction record treated traffic stoppage as the crisis in corporate dependency as background noise. Judges looked first at moving trains, Railroad Council looked first at restoring schedules, and federal officials looked first at whether the mails were crossing state lines. Each phrase in the record narrowed the field of vision until industrial subordination disappeared behind transportation necessity. That is why the Pullman documents functioned as weapons rather than neutral descriptions. Interstate commerce carried enormous weight in a republic now tied together by rails, grain shipments, refrigerated cars, and timed freight connections. Once the American Railway Union showed it could paralyze that system, the federal government acquired a powerful reason to define solidarity as menace. A local strike could pass through injunctions, deputy marshals, cabinet decisions, and troop deployment within days because the paperwork had already transformed labor conflict into a test of sovereignty. The most revealing line in the record is what never appears with equal force: the right of workers to contest a closed economic environment built by an integrated corporation. Pullman workers remained legally free to quit, yet quitting left rents due, debts unpaid, and an employer still sitting over houses, shops, and wages. The papers that crushed the boycott recognized disruption faster than domination. That imbalance was the real constitutional achievement of the injunction campaign, and it stayed in place long after the strike itself was over. The defeat of Pullman did not end labor organization or public suspicion of monopoly. It did show how costly broad confrontation could become when workers lacked reliable allies in courts, legislatures, or executive offices. The AFL kept growing through craft unionism, populists and progressives kept pressing for stronger regulation, and antitrust politics remained active because the defeats at Homestead and Pullman did not settle the question of industrial power. They sharpened it. Industrial concentration continued anyway. Carnegie sold his steel interest to Morgan in 1901, helping create United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation. Standard Oil expanded until antitrust litigation broke it apart in 1911. The Interstate Commerce Commission existed after 1887, yet its early powers were narrow, and courts often proved more willing to use antitrust doctrine against unions than against large corporate combinations. Federal authority grew, but it did so unevenly and often on terms favorable to business stability. That pattern taught employers and workers different lessons. Employers learned that injunctions, police power, state militias, and federal troops could defeat coordinated action. Workers learned that national organization was necessary and that it remained dangerously exposed without statutory protection. Citizens watching from outside the mills and rail yards learned something else. The question was no longer whether industrial conflict affected the public. The question was which side government would treat as the greater danger when production stopped. That choice never disappeared. Later, reformers answered it with labor boards, antitrust enforcement, and inspection regimes, but those answers grew out of the failures of the 1890s rather than out of consensus. Once prosperity, monopoly, strikes, and public order had fused into one national problem, there was no easy exit. A government could discipline labor, discipline capital, or attempt to referee both, but every choice carried a different definition of freedom in an industrial republic.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.